This is episode 13 of the Nothing Human podcast, Three Powers of the Human Spirit, part 13. More on the affections.
I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me.
Welcome to the Nothing Human podcast, a biblically informed think space for exploring and articulating all the ways we make or break sense of human experience. I'm your host, Michael Minkoff. From my youngest days, I have been fascinated with categories of thought, those often unconscious filing mechanisms that invisibly populate our premises, direct our inquiries, and ordain our conclusions. Join me as we investigate and interrogate our assumptions in an effort to articulate a more cohesive understanding of human information within the superstructure of God's truth. Welcome back to the Nothing Human podcast for the 13th episode on the three powers of the human spirit. If you haven't already listened to the other 12 episodes in this series, I recommend you do that. I've heard from at least one listener that these episodes work tolerably well out of sequence, but I recommend listening to them in order. Thank you to everyone who supports me and my family through Patreon. I'll be posting a new article in my Questions in Genesis series on why Satan fell this month, and that will be available early to Patreon supporters. I also post monthly progress updates with some behind-the-scenes notes exclusively to Patreon supporters. I also have a couple of chat threads available exclusively to Patreon supporters there on Patreon. And next series, I plan to post early access to podcast episodes. Thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon. You make it easier for me to keep doing this. And to all of you who have rated or reviewed Nothing Human on Apple and Spotify, thank you as well. You can find all of my available podcasts with episode notes on my website, nothinghumanpodcast.com, and you can also comment on episodes there if you want. I do respond, and I might convert some of those comments and exchanges into future episodes. So keep doing whatever you can, and thank you all so very much. Let's get into it. One of the most common objections that I get to my claim that the affections and emotions are undervalued and dismissed, especially in Western contexts, is that in fact the opposite is true, that emotionalism and a rank overvaluing of feelings seems to be the norm, and that everywhere in politics and the market and economics and ethics and all sorts of other areas, it seems like feelings are transcendent and more important than anything else. And a lot of people would say we actually need to run in the opposite direction, that we need to go back to the good old days where men had stiff upper lips and they weren't allowed to cry, and women were in their place, barefoot in the kitchen and preferably pregnant, and where all the emotions and feelings were left out of important decision making. One of the major problems with this objection is that it believes that the affections, even at their greatest strength, are nothing more than just an overflow of emotion or strong passion. And we've discussed this briefly before when we've talked about the ordering of the affections in brief. But the cultivation of the affections is not the same as overwhelming, raw, undisciplined, and uncultivated emotion or passion. There is a distinction between the affections and the passions are merely signposts of what's really going on within the value set of the affections. So, in actuality, sentimentality, which I will admit there is a lot of in our culture, and emotionalism, which again I will admit there is a lot of, is not the same as putting the affections in their proper place. Sentimentality or emotionalism is actually in some ways an attack on and a violence to or abuse of the emotional and affectional capacity. Sentimentality or emotionalism is defined in this fine introduction to poetry called Western Wind as an emotion in excess of its object. Benjamin Myers does an admirable job exploring this in his First Things article, The Sentimentality Trap. I recommend you read it. It's a great article. And in it, Myers quotes from Flannery O'Connor's essay, The Church and the Fiction Writer, on this very issue. And she writes, quote, "We lost our innocence in the fall, and our return to it is through the redemption which was brought about by Christ's death and by our slow participation in it. Sentimentality is a skipping of this process in its concrete reality and an early arrival at a mock state of innocence which strongly suggests its opposite. Pornography, on the other hand, is essentially sentimental, for it leaves out the connection of sex with its hard purpose and so far disconnects it from its meaning in life as to make it simply an experience for its own sake." End quote. Myers actually makes the might seem outrageous claim that given this connection, Thomas Kincaid paintings are basically pornographic sentimentality. In the same way as pornography, Thomas Kincaid paintings give you the promised good without preparing you for the real struggle of the actual journey toward that good. Think about pornography is the same exact way. A real relationship with a real person requires sacrifice. It requires work. It requires knowing the other person, being vulnerable with the other person. It requires mutual exchange, mutual interchange, a developing relationship, deepening connections in order to have that same quote unquote good sex. If all you have is just the good sex that comes all the way at the end of that journey, not only does pornography give you something that is false, meaning it isn't that easy, it is never that easy, but also it doesn't prepare you for that difficulty. So a person who is sated on pornography ends up over time becoming weaker and weaker and weaker in their capacity to actually gain the good that is promised in pornography in reality. It is fake, it's false, and it will never be true. And in fact, the more pornography they consume and the more their tastes and affections are shaped by pornography, the further and further and further and further real good sex will be from that particular person. So you can see that sentimentality gives you a promised good, but it doesn't actually offer you the skills necessary or the cultivation necessary to actually gain that promised good in reality. Very much connected to fantasy in those terms and escapism in those terms. It's why pornography and video games and other kinds of things where you have this easy promised good that you're able to achieve with very little actual effort. It's the same as fast food. It's the same as Thomas Kincaid. All of these things are offering you easy, harmless goods without any effort or difficulty. And all good things do require some degree of sacrifice, some degree of difficulty. If they don't require some degree of difficulty, they're really not that good. There actually is a pretty deep connection then between pornography, Thomas Kincaid, video games, at least some of them, and all those kinds of things, fast food, etc. And most emotionalism suffers from this same problem. And you might be surprised to find that in totalitarian and will-oriented states, emotionalism is the only affection that's actually allowed. That may seem totally counterintuitive, but emotionalism is harmless and unchallenging emotion. Truly powerful, challenging, intimidating, or persuasive emotion is never allowed within emotionalism. And that is why emotionalism and totalitarianism tend to go hand in hand. Because emotionalism and sentimentality are the only affectional life that the will can allow without it being challenged. These emotions leave the will entirely unchallenged. It can do whatever it will, and these particular kinds of emotions, these safe, harmless, unchallenging emotions, are largely not going to affect it. The will can pet the head of sentimentality and say, there, little feelings, go play house and have your tea party, and don't you bother your little head about anything serious. I'll handle all the important things. Viewing affections in this way is part of our problem, actually, of the will and the intellect viewing the affections as a worthless little brother or little sister that really doesn't do anything of any great value and needs to be accommodated or exploited only in the terms that it is useful, which is one of the reasons why there are largely two, emotions that are available in will-oriented and intellect-oriented societies. On one side of those emotions are totally harmless, safe, good feelings that allow you some escape from the grind of reality and some degree of relief and entertainment and amusement. All of that's allowed. The other side of the emotions that are allowed are anger and wrath because they're effective in accomplishing the purposes of the will. But when you view affections in only this way, and you basically excise from them all the things that would be challenging, that would be difficult, that would interrogate or investigate or overturn or require something of the will or of the intellect, when you have removed all of those things from the affections and basically said you're not allowed to feel these things or go down these roads, and you sequester all that off, you compartmentalize all of those feelings, the negative feelings, the shame, the guilt, the depression, the sadness, also any hurt feelings or traumas or pains from being abused or from being misused. You can see that by compartmentalizing all those feelings and not allowing them to touch anything real, the will and the intellect maintain their degree of dominance, but at a great cost, at a severe and serious cost. And right here, I just want to say, and I don't think I've said it before, that the affections are viewed as weak because the affections really are vulnerable. And there's a vulnerability in the affections that cause many people to bury them. And you notice this with a lot of people who on the exterior seem spiny and calloused and maybe even harsh. You'll notice that a lot of times there are sensitive and wounded places in those people that you occasionally have access to that are behind the spines. And I think of these people kind of like cactuses in the desert, where they live in at least a perceived scarcity mindset, where they have to protect themselves from threats all around because they do have this tender and soft part on the inside of them. And oftentimes they're not processing through that, and all you see or experience are the spines on the outside. And I think it's important to understand the affections in this sense of being tender or vulnerable or gentle. There is a vulnerability there. I understand that. But I don't think of it in terms of weakness. My eldest daughter is extraordinarily affectional and is one of the most intuitive feelers that I have ever known. And quite incredible, actually. I'll tell you a story about her. She was very young, and I had taken her to the mechanic's office, and she was sitting there in her chair while I was up at the desk dealing with the clerk. And there was another man, an older gentleman, who was there in the lobby waiting for his car. So she looked over to him and she saw him, and I think she must have recognized that there was some degree of loneliness or isolation to him. And she said to him, "Are you married?" And he said, "No, but I'd really like to be." And then she said to him, "Well, are you a kind man?" And he said, "No, I guess not, but you probably shouldn't be talking to strangers." Do you see that in basically two questions? My daughter had gotten to the heart of his issue, like the issue of his life. And I don't even know how she understood this, but there was something about him that said loneliness to her. And so she said, "Hey, you're lonely. Are you married? Do you have someone in your life? Because you don't seem like you do." And she was right. He didn't. So he says, "No, I'm not married, but I'd like to be." And then she diagnosed the central problem. "Well, are you a kind man? If you were a kind man, maybe you would have someone in your life." And you think about, how did that girl, this little girl in the lobby, diagnose that situation so quickly and ask such penetrating questions in such a short amount of time? Now, is she weak? Well, yes, as he pointed out in the end, as he emphasized in the end, that, this little girl basically by herself with her dad some distance away is in danger and maybe shouldn't be talking to strangers. But notice what he's saying is that force or violence might be used against such a sensitive and unprotected girl who was so insightful, who asked such challenging and intuitive questions. And so throughout her life, I have attempted to protect her from those kinds of violences and that kind of force. But I have also recognized that there's a great strength, a great power in what she's able to do, in what she's able to feel, in what she's able to understand, kind of behind the appearances of things. And I've talked to her like this, that she is not weak, but she is sensitive, in the same way that an electron microscope is very sensitive. Now, if I were to say to you that an electron microscope was worthless because unlike the tool of a hammer, an electron microscope cannot be dragged behind a four-wheeler in the desert and still be functional at the end of its trip. And on the other hand, a hammer can be dragged behind a four-wheeler through the desert and still be functional for its purpose at the end of that trip. Does that mean that the electron microscope is more worthless than the hammer? No, it's a different kind of tool, and very sensitive tools have to be cared for gingerly, but that doesn't mean that they are weak, and it doesn't mean that they are useless. And I've tried to talk about affections in these terms with my own daughter in order to help her to understand her value in the world, but I also recognize, like that mean single man recognized, that she is greatly vulnerable. And because of this vulnerability, she probably does need people around her who are willing to surround her in some degree of protection. So that's my thought on the quote-unquote weakness of the affections. So the strength of the affections is not in the overflow of passion or emotionalism. That is not really the strength of the affections. The most powerful affections are cultivated affections, and sentimentality is fundamentally not cultivated affections. In fact, most sentimentality occurs in environments where the affections have not been disciplined or cultivated to any great degree because they've been relegated to places of uselessness and worthlessness. With that said, how do you cultivate the affections? How do you order the affections? Before we can talk about this practically, and I will give you some practical tips at a certain point from what I've found, I think that this is not a very well-researched or well-developed topic in general, and I do feel oftentimes like I am talking about things that haven't really been discussed very much, and that's not terribly helpful for me. I would love for other insightful people to be able to help me along, give me additional information that I might be able to draw on, even just evidences of different attempts that have been made. We'll talk about a little bit of that a little bit later. But first, we need to talk about a few things that need to be firmly understood. One, the affections are not immutable or unchangeable. It is important to understand that the tastes that you have, the feelings that you have, the things that you love, and the things that you hate are not fixed for all time. You aren't just born this way. You were developed into the person that you are now in terms of the things you love and hate, and you can change those things over time. And the affections themselves are able to be changed. They are able to be ordered. You need to believe that, or they will not change. You will continue to function the way you have functioned if you believe you can't function any other way. So it is important to recognize that change is possible. You need to believe that first, or you will not change. Secondly, it's important to understand that good and evil have objective realities, spiritual realities of life and death. So good and evil are not any more subjective or arbitrary than the categories of righteousness or wickedness or truth and falsehood. Now, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because the categories of righteousness and wickedness, truth and falsehood also have some degree of relativity. Good and evil has some degree of relativity. If you don't understand what relative means, maybe I will have an episode on it. But what I do not mean by relative is arbitrary. I mean that it is related to other things, interconnected to other things. In other words, there are truths that are relative to particular circumstances and that are not the same, factually speaking, from one circumstance to another. For instance, an apple will fall to the ground on the earth, an apple will float in the air in space. This doesn't mean that gravity is arbitrary or that it doesn't hold. This is due to relative differences in those particular contexts, and those relationships, relative, things still hold to be the case. And in fact, it is the relationships that are fixed. And same with righteousness and wickedness. Again, I'm not talking about situational morality necessarily, but obviously there is some degree of relativity involved in what is right and what is wrong, in the sense that an objective action is right for one person might not be right for another. For instance, I can take a wall out of my house. I can take a sledgehammer to any wall in my house I want to. But if you were to do the same thing, that would be considered impermissible and wrong. Well, I'm doing exactly what you're doing. Yeah, I get that. But there's obviously a relative difference because of our relationships to this house, one being an owner, the other not being an owner. So I hope you understand what I mean then by relative. So good and evil have similarly relative realities to them, in that one context to another, one situation to another might look a little bit different, but the relationships will hold. But This is not subjective in the sense of arbitrary. There are non-arbitrary realities of good and evil because there are non-arbitrary realities of life and death, which means that taste, affections, can actually be growing in a particular direction and toward real good and away from real evil. And that is not just a subjective, taste-oriented, eye of the beholder situation. There are objective realities that we are driving toward, i.e., the life of God. That is the ultimate object of the ordered affections. And that is not nothing. God has a personal character that is fixed and unchanging. So that is something that we are driving for as a real fixed object. I hope that makes sense. Third, taste should be growing to an understanding of ultimate good and ultimate evil. So I hope that's also clear. If there is an objective life of God that we are supposed to be growing toward and understanding better and better, then our taste, which is affectional discernment, should be growing to an understanding of ultimate good and ultimate evil. So this is important. What is ultimately righteous will be inseparable from what is ultimately good. This is where they come together in their ultimate reality, meaning God is God, God is righteous, and God is good. There's no conflict between righteousness and good in God. And so if there is a conflict in us, as we've talked about before, it's an issue of scope or time. That ultimately, righteousness and goodness will have the same exact place of destination. So to determine what is pleasing, not just in the short term, is the goal of the affections. The affections want to determine what is pleasing in the long term. And if it actually does determine what is pleasing in the long term, that will be the exact same object as righteousness or as truth. So to determine what is pleasing not just in the short term, but in the final say, and to determine what is ugly not just in the short term, but in the final say, these are the actual goals of the affections. I'm reiterating this because I think it's a really important concept, and I don't think that a lot of people quite get it. If you were to tell people that ultimately whatever is ugly is also wrong, most people would say, that doesn't sound right. But ultimately, that is right. That whatever is ugly, deformed, destructive, death-dealing, death-oriented will not prove in the end to be righteous. And whatever is righteous will in the end prove to be beautiful. So whatever is truly and ultimately beautiful will prove to be truly and ultimately righteous in the end. So that is actually the goal of the affections. It doesn't have a different goal than the will or the intellect. But that's actually really helpful for us because it enables us to have different angles on our journey. So maybe we're off the track when it comes to the truth, or maybe we're off the track when it comes to righteousness, or maybe we're off the track when it comes to goodness. And the discrepancy that we feel between the three powers within us that we're attempting to integrate and to resolve is part of our journey toward God. Let me show you that this is the case from the scriptures. It's not as clear in English translation, so I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into what's happening in the Greek. But in Hebrews 5, verses 12 through 14, you read this. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk, and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. Now, when you look at that, you might think that this is talking about a moral situation, trained to discern good and evil. And again, we talked about this in episode 6, that good and evil in the scriptures tend to be less of a moral category and more of a cosmic or creational category, even a material category. This text is actually even more like that than some other texts, especially in the New Testament. The New Testament is dealing with a little bit of a shift where there is a conflation of these terms happening more and more within the Greek and Western mindset, as we've talked about before. Yet in this text particularly, I would say the author of Hebrews is making an even more explicit point about a cosmic or creational reality. For one, in verse 14, the word translated senses there is actually the Greek word aestheterion. Now, that is where we get the word aesthetics. And the word for senses probably would be better translated there, tastes, which makes sense. He's talking about an analogy connecting milk and solid food and other things like that. So it would make sense that you would translate this aesthetics, that have their aesthetic sense or their taste trained because of practice. Trained to discern what? Good and evil. Again, this is not a moral category. In this particular text, it's even more obvious it's talking about a creational category because the word for good isn't even the normal word used for good in a potentially moral sense, agathos. This is actually from the word kalos, which means beautiful or fitting. And the word that's used here for evil is not the more moral term paneros, which is used in other contexts, but this is actually kakos, from which we get words like cacophony, meaning unpleasing, displeasing sound. So this actually word kakos means bad, ugly, deformed, displeasing. So, in order to achieve maturity, even in moral terms, we have to achieve a greater understanding of taste, which starts to discern the beautiful and fitting from the ugly and displeasing. And there's a maturity involved there. And I think oftentimes what you see, again, with sentimentalism, going back to that briefly, we can see that sentimentalism is more of a milk than solid food situation. And that truly those who have their senses or their tastes developed into maturity so that they can eat more solid food, they're able to deal with all the different kinds of emotional and affectional information. And they're actually able to discern in them good, fitting, beautiful, and evil, bad, ugly, displeasing. And this is an important part of our moral development and our virtuous development is this development of taste and our affections. So, I would say it is extremely important and even biblically warranted that we develop better taste, that we actually order our affections to love what is objectively good and to be repulsed by and repelled by what is objectively evil, even when there are times when we have to do certain evils, harms to ourselves or to others for the sake of righteousness in the short term. Ultimately, our goal is not evil. Ultimately, our goal is good because God is good and He is the object, ultimately, of our affections. So, we've talked about three things that we have to understand beforehand. One, affections can change, meaning you're not just born this way with whatever feelings you might already have. Two, good and evil have objective realities, meaning life and death in a spiritual sense. Three, taste should be growing to an understanding of ultimate good and ultimate evil. And then four, affectional change has to be voluntary. It has to be intrinsic. It cannot occur extrinsically. And one of the reasons for this is that most all extrinsic movements of change in the affections are actually volitional and not affectional, meaning it's somebody else forcing or pressuring you to be a different person than you actually are. And if you do not volunteer to change, if you do not attempt this change on your own terms voluntarily, you cannot change the affections. The affections are actually ultimately voluntary, and unlike intellectual and volitional shaping, which is able to be affected to some extent through force or brainwashing or gaslighting, you really can't force affectional change. We've mentioned this before. I just want to reassert this because it's very important. The fifth thing that should be established is that affectional change takes great courage because it requires vulnerability and often involves very great sacrifice or cost. So, if you're committed to affectional change, I just want you to know it's going to take great courage. And there are going to be lots of times in this process where you're probably going to want to turn back and where it does not seem like what you're doing is even worth it, especially because you're going to be increasing this sensitivity that we talked about. Pains or traumas or abuses or difficulties or other things, shames, guilts, longings, desires, resentments, and bitternesses that had been long buried and dismissed may start to come up. And it takes great courage to keep opening the doors of that dungeon and the doors of that cellar and not know what monsters might be behind it. It takes great courage to do that. But what you need to know is if you don't have the courage to do it, it doesn't change the reality of what's happening. No matter how much darkness you allow to dwell within you, And no matter how many times you try to shut those gates and keep the Minotaur in the labyrinth, the reality is that all of those things within you that you are trying to ignore are still there, and they're having a great impact on you and on your life. Maybe not now, but maybe in the future. And it will become more and more apparent that that is the case. And most people who don't invest in emotional and affectional health now end up paying for it and regretting that they didn't in the future. So, yes, it takes courage now to change now, especially if you don't have to and no one's forcing you to. And that's the only way it'll work anyway. But it is also the truth, and you should understand this, that if you do not take the time to invest in it now, you are going to pay this cost one way or the other, and it's better to pay this cost now than to pay this cost in the future. There are tons and tons of people who have great regrets about not investing in their affectional life later on in life when it's much harder to do and sometimes impossible. All of that up front, let's talk about some first steps in affectional processing. I want to open this part on affectional processing by bringing up a book that I've been reading by Dr. Joseph Nicolosi. It's called Shame and Attachment Loss. Now, this is a book that was written to address a therapeutic model, reparative therapy, for homosexuals who, because of deeply held values, are unwilling to embrace a gay lifestyle. In other words, this book was written for same-sex attracted men who believe their desire to be immoral. So if I'm going to put these in three power terms, these are more than likely affectionally oriented men whose partner power, the will, informed by religious upbringing, believes at least a major desire of the affections is wrong. The will is basically telling the affections, hey, this thing you desire, meaning the same-sex attraction that you have, is morally wrong and you need to stop it. So these men can't shake that conviction. This book is written for them, and reparative therapy was developed for them specifically. This book is one of the few books I've heard of that attempts to address changing or reordering the affections in terms of the affections instead of in terms of the will. In other words, the will would try to change these unwanted desires by repressing them or shutting them out or forcing the individual to, quote, act straight through different habits or routines or mannerisms or behaviors. You can talk about so-called conversion therapy, and they had very low rates of success. And one of the major reasons that conversion therapy had such low rates of success is because most homosexual men are not will-oriented, and most conversion therapy was will-oriented. And most homosexual men actually involve that very small minority of men in the population that are affectionally oriented. And this is one of the reasons why these men were and sometimes are called effeminate. They seem to be operating like women, like most women, in other words. And so even though Nicolosi's book is aimed at same-sex attracted men who want to alter their affections, some of the strategies in it seem really pioneering, to me at least, in the realm of the affections generally. And so I think it actually is pretty insightful and generalizable. I'll give you an example. Here's a quote. Affective competence refers to the way in which the person handles emotional experiences. Affective competence is possible only in the vitality states of assertion and grief, the only two self-states in which there is accurate self-awareness. The two negative alternatives to affective competence are feeling but not dealing, being flooded with affect but distrustful of disclosure to the other. Dealing but not feeling. This is behavioral engagement but without genuine emotional involvement. Feeling requires taking conscious ownership of one's emotions. Dealing requires honestly expressing those emotions interpersonally. Feeling and dealing are preconditions for authenticity and for the integration for inner and outer selves. I think that's a really good quote. I think it's really helpful. And I should also give credit where credit is due. Dr. Nicolosi says that much of his therapeutic approach and the framework for the quote I just read draws from the work of Diana Fascia, pioneer of the accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy model and founder of the AEDP Institute, whose work I look forward to learning more about. But for now, we'll talk about this quote. It might take a little bit to break it down a bit, but centrally, he's talking about the two negative alternatives to affective competence. I think this was the part of it that I really am interested in, where he talks about feeling but not dealing, meaning that you have these internal feelings and you're flooded with them. You're flooded with these internal feelings, but you're not willing to disclose those feelings to anyone else because you're distrusting of them. And a lot of people have this experience. I don't want to tell my spouse or my friend or my significant other that I feel this way because they might punish me for it in some way or another. Or I might feel ashamed, or it might affect the view that they have of me, or it might affect my promotion at work, or it might affect this other good thing that I want to get. And so I'm going to keep it to myself. I'm going to feel it, but I'm not actually going to deal with the feeling. And that's pretty common, I would say. The other is dealing, but not feeling. And this is behavioral engagement along a certain line, but without any genuine emotional involvement, meaning that you suppress the feeling altogether, you dismiss the feeling altogether, and you just basically shut it out. So feeling but not dealing, you might have all sorts of, a compartmentalized feeling that's going on that you might even be feeling. You might be willing to feel it, but you're not willing to deal with that feeling when it comes to other people. You're not willing to address it, be vulnerable, express what that feeling is, try and process through it, maybe not even with yourself. Dealing but not feeling is basically just jumping straight to doing the thing you think you should be doing if you felt the right way, even though you don't feel the right way about it. And so you end up having this disconnect in your behavior from how you really feel about it. And he says that in feeling, you have to take conscious ownership of your emotions, and dealing requires honestly expressing those emotions interpersonally. And that's really the most challenging thing for most people, I would say. Feeling, it just comes upon you. You feel anger, you feel resentment, you feel joy, you feel sadness, you feel longing, you feel repulsion, and you don't know why necessarily, but you feel the feeling and you can't deny that you felt it. And truly, properly feeling is to take ownership of that emotion, to say, I feel this and I feel it for a particular reason, and I need to figure out what that reason actually is. Dealing with the feeling almost always involves being able to express and articulate what it is to somebody else and being understood. If you're not truly understood about the way that you feel, and that is not able to be expressed, it's hard to be authentic. That's what he talks about here in this section. It's hard to be authentic because how can you integrate the behavior of your outer self and the feelings of your inner self or the longings of your inner self if you're not actually able to fully and honestly express those feelings in your outer self? And that's where the vulnerability and the courage comes in, because especially if your inner feelings are not what you would want them to be, as is the case in this book, particularly of same sex attracted males who believe their same sex attraction to be wrong. So they have a very hard time then integrating their inner and their outer selves. And there may be very few people that they feel like they can be the same self, inner and outer, with. And that's one of the major reasons why a lot of homosexuals tend to gravitate towards homosexual communities where they can be both their inner and outer selves without change. And I think that change is required of all people. And any environment that's saying you don't have to change is somewhat appealing because then you can feel and deal, maybe, or you feel like you can. But if you're feeling and you're dealing both, but it's just you're manicuring or curating your environment so that you can do that without change, I would say that you're going to stay infantile and you're not really truly developing affective competence. So I want to take a cue from the Psalms and talk a little bit more about some baby steps of how you might be able to actually develop your affections and to shape them. So, looking at the Psalms, you can see that the psalmists, all of them, have just a varied experience of emotions. It's all over the map. In fact, John Calvin, in his introduction to his commentary on the Psalms, said, I have been accustomed to call this book, I think not inappropriately, an anatomy of all the parts of the soul. For there is not an emotion of which any one can be conscious that is not here represented as in a mirror. End quote. And that's definitely true. Think about all the different emotions that are actually expressed in the Psalms. The heights of exultation and rejoicing, and just the absolute depths of complete and utter feelings of abandonment, depression, apathy, anger, pain, hurt, all and everything in between. And so we can take a cue from the Psalms and know that the psalmist laid these feelings out first and foremost before God. And the great thing about God is that you can tell him anything, and he is not going to be all that worried about it. It's not going to hurt him. There are feelings that you have that if you were to express them and try and deal with them with the wrong people would be disastrous. You would hurt those people, and it would not be helpful to you either. The nice thing about starting with God is that you can lay them out honestly before God without any fear that the pain that he experiences in those things is going to be reverberated back onto you. In other words, God can handle it. So laying out your actual feelings, whatever they may be, in complete honesty before God is a great first step. And a lot of people have disagreed with me on this. I remember having an extended discussion with actually a pastor who said that it was wrong, sinful, to lay your feelings out before God in all honesty if those feelings were angry with God, bitter with God. And I even mentioned Job. And I said, that doesn't seem to be the case with Job. Job laid out his bitterness and his sadness and his anger very clearly and very forthrightly before God, and God doesn't seem to judge him for that. And this pastor actually replied that Job was wrong to do that Job should not have just laid his feelings out before God like that, but he should have dealt with his feelings beforehand, resolved himself, kind of composed himself, and then gone in prayer before God, and that was why God rebuked him in the end. And I actually don't view God's response to Job actually as a rebuke. God's response to Job is to freely reveal himself in the same way that Job had freely revealed himself. But in the end of the story, and you can go and look at it if you want, God says to the friends, hey, go get Job to pray for you and offer sacrifice for you so that you can be forgiven, because you did not speak what was right concerning me as my servant Job did. So right there, and this is at the end of the story. This is after the whole thing, after the voice from the whirlwind and all of that. So I don't really see there that God is saying Job was in the wrong. He seems to generally say Job did what was right and even said what was right about God. And if you look at some of the things Job said, you're like, okay, looks like, I guess, that God isn't really all that concerned with any honest thing that you say. He'll help you sort it. He would much rather you be honest than anything else. And part of the issue I have with this pastor's recommendation, and it doesn't even make any sense, is if the feeling is sinful, let's say it's a total sinful, wrong feeling. I feel something wrong about God and I'm angry with God in a way that I shouldn't be. And you're telling me that I have a sin and I can actually fix it and deal with it without going to God, then why would I want to or need to go to God at all? I mean, the whole reason why David and Job and the rest of them go to God is because God's the only one who can actually deal with the situation, especially if they're in sin. You're telling me that I can deal with sin in my heart without God's help and involvement? I just think that's silly. And I think for a pastor to say that is really ridiculous. And I kind of told him that I thought that it was against the idea of the gospel, that Jesus died for us while we were yet sinners, that we need rescue when we're in sin. Who better to turn to than God, even if you are feeling sinful feelings? And he, just got insulted and told me that he had been a pastor for decades, and how dare I tell him that he didn't understand the gospel or whatever. Anyway, that conversation didn't go very well. But I still agree with what I said, which is that Job, David, we have tons of examples in the scriptures that God approves of. I even asked him about some of the Psalms where David was resentful in the Psalms and angry and disappointed about God. And he said that David was speaking in a fleshly spirit in those Psalms, which again, you're like, well, God, they're included in the Bible. So if I need to go to you so that you, Mr. Pastor, can tell me which of the Psalms I'm allowed to pray and which of the Psalms are in a fleshly spirit, why would God include both of those in his book of Psalms that we're supposed to be using for our hymn book in the church and for our own personal prayer book? I just, that doesn't make any sense to me. So, I think it's perfectly valid to take a cue from the Psalms and lay out your actual feelings in complete honesty. Complete honesty. Do you understand me? Complete honesty before God. And then ask God to help you understand why you feel what you feel, no matter what this may cost to your view of self. And he might ask, well, what does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. I had a major resentment toward another person that I didn't even realize. They had hurt me, and I thought I had forgiven them in my heart. I was pretty sure I had actually forgiven them in my heart. But I showed up at an event, and I didn't expect them to be there, and they just showed up at the event. And as soon as they walked through the door frame and I turned and I saw them, I had an immediate visceral reaction of repulsion and disgust and resentment, which indicated to me that I did not actually feel the forgiveness, that I hadn't really forgiven them in my heart fully, and that there was still this resentment toward them swirling around in there. And that is somewhat costly to my view of self. I like to consider myself a very forgiving person. I like to consider myself someone who, if I've granted forgiveness, then I truly do grant it. But obviously, I hadn't really granted it in that. And I talked to God about the way that I felt. And we got to the root of some of the reasons why I continue to have that feeling of resentment and that feeling of repulsion and disgust. And I realized that I had been too quick to say that I had forgiven them and that there were other things that I still needed to deal with and that there were unresolved matters that I continued to need to pray about. And I'm still praying about those things, actually. But it was helpful to me, even though it changed my view of myself to some extent. I wanted to view myself as a much more forgiving person than I actually am. And so, but once I realized that feeling was there, it was real, that was what was happening, I laid that out before God, and we have been working on investigating where that comes from and what I need to do about it. The next part of this, I think, that's really important, after you've laid out your feelings honestly before God and asked Him to help you understand them and sort through them and name them, what they actually are, where they've actually come from, why they're actually there, and to validate them. They are almost certainly there for a good reason. Now, it might be wrong, it might be off, it might be false, it might be whatever, but it's honest, okay? When people talk about the affections or the emotions being deceptive or dishonest, that's just simply not true. The information that's coming from your emotions and your affections is probably the most honest information you have about yourself. It's one of the few places where it's really, really hard to lie about yourself. Now, that doesn't mean the feeling is right. I'm just saying it's probably accurate. So go ahead and listen to it and say, why is it there? Where is it coming from? And what does it say about me? And lay that out before God and attempt with all your heart in prayer to get to the bottom of it and to accept it, to integrate it. And also learn to value negative emotion as constructive and instructive. Especially within a realm of sentimentality, we're told to basically get rid of all negative emotion. Negative emotion is terrible, negative emotion is bad. And I feel like a lot of us are like Joy in the movie Inside Out, where we want to make sure that sadness is never at the controls because sadness wrecks everything. And then by the end of the movie, you realize, no, there is value in these negative emotions like sadness because they prompt loved ones to come and help when we need help. That's just one and probably a fairly minor area where negative emotions are constructive and instructive. But I'd say, even though we want to avoid feeling those things, you can't really avoid them. Trying to dismiss them, trying to put them aside, tends to only grow them. And they need to be integrated. In a future episode, we'll talk a little bit about trauma and how it relates to the three powers. But you can have trauma that happens. And most of the time, if you try and push that trauma down and not think about it and not deal with it, maybe even forget the incidents that occurred, that doesn't mean it doesn't affect you. it definitely will still affect you. It'll affect your body, it'll affect your life, it'll affect your habits, it will affect the ways that you react to and act in the world. You can't really help that. So it needs to be integrated. It's important for it to be understood, fully felt, validated, and integrated. And it can be, negative emotion can be very constructive and very instructive, not just for the understanding of ourselves, but also for the understanding of others as well. So I hope that's helpful to a better understanding of what to do, some baby steps toward becoming more affectionally ordered. The first start of affectional ordering is to take a cue from the Psalms, lay out your actual feelings in complete honesty before God, ask Him to help you to sort through them, understand them, know where they're coming from, why they're there, where they're going, what their purposes are, and validate them, understand that they are almost certainly accurate, valid assessments of what's going on within you and how you're viewing other things, and learn to value negative emotions also as constructive and instructive. Another way that you can develop and increase the power of your affections is to learn how to imitate those people in the past who have greatly understood the affectional powers. And probably the one largest class of people who have understood the affectional power are artists. And the great and timeless works of art are a workshop of the affections. And I highly recommend that anyone who wants to understand affections more deeply and the assessment and discernment of good and evil in a more mature way should train their aesthetic sense and their taste by going to people who have great skill, either present people or people who have lived in the past, and learning to imitate and understand and receive their particular assessments of good and evil as they have created those in the past. This would be the great works of art, visual art, the great works of cinema, the great works of literature and poetry. I highly recommend memorizing poems. Highly recommend going and to museums and looking at great works that have been around for hundreds of years and been recognized as great for hundreds of years. I think that you will grow in aesthetic discernment and you will grow in your capacity for the affections. You will exit the realm of sentimentality and have much greater and finer and more powerful and more sensitive capacities of affection if you train yourself in the great works of art that have been produced in the past. I was the co-founder of an organization that's been involved in trying to explain the importance of the arts. I think the arts and the affections are deeply connected. And so you can check out my work in Renew the Arts if you're interested. That's the organization that I co-founded a number of years ago. We partner with artists and with patrons to attempt to make the work of art within the church more prominent. And we think that's a really important work. I recommend you check that out if you are interested in learning a little bit more about how to develop your taste and your discernment in the aesthetic realms, which I think will help you in your development of the affectional power. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions for clarity, you can ask them on my website, nothinghumanpodcast.com, on the page for this particular episode, episode 13. And I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. I know that I didn't probably give you as full a rundown of all the ways in which the affections can be ordered today, but I wanted to get a little more deeply into it, and I hope that this has been edifying and illuminating, and I will talk to you soon. So until next time.
I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me. Nothing human, nothing